Welcome to Retro Reads, where timeless mysteries come to life. Today, a new case awaits, full of twists, secrets, and thrilling revelations. Settle in, relax, and let the adventure begin. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and at what time. Let's get started and dive into this unforgettable story. It was a Tuesday, which meant Fritz served corned beef hash and a poached egg for breakfast, with toast, 2 slices, golden brown, crisp at the edge, soft at the center. It's a rhythm more sacred in the brownstone than the orchid schedule, and that's saying something. I had just taken my first bite when Wolfe made the sound. It wasn't quite a grunt, not yet a growl, more like the auditory equivalent of a raised eyebrow. He laid down his knife with unnecessary ceremony. "Fritz!" he called, his voice velvet-draped steel. Our chef appeared almost instantly, towel over one arm, dignity in full display. I kept chewing. Someone had to enjoy breakfast. "This toast," Wolfe said, lifting the offending item between 2 fingers as though it had been retrieved from a crime scene, "is burnt." I looked. It was a shade darker than usual, but within the bounds of edible law. Fritz leaned forward. "I assure you, sir, it was set to the usual dial." Wolfe did not respond. He examined the toast as if it had personally betrayed him. "We maintain standards in this house, Fritz. If the mechanism is faulty, replace it." "Yes, sir," Fritz said stiffly. "Immediately." He exited, shoulders set like bayonets. Wolfe pushed his plate away and reached for his beer. I reached for another bite. "If that's how you react to breakfast, I shudder to think how you'd handle arson." He ignored me. I didn't know then that toast would be the least strange thing about that morning. I found Fritz 20 minutes later, crouched in the kitchen, toaster in pieces, a frown as deep as a trench dug for a secret. "I swear on Escoffier," he muttered. "It was perfect when I tested it yesterday." "Appliances don't usually develop a vendetta overnight," I offered. He gave me a look, sharp enough to fillet cod. Back in the office, Wolfe sat in his chair with eyes closed, not in rest, but in judgment. He often processed minor disturbances like one would a pour wine, swirl, sniff, spit. "Archie," he said without opening his eyes, "a domestic instrument does not develop mischief. Something is amiss." "You think someone sabotaged the toast?" "I think," he said, "that Fritz is rattled. That is not usual. It indicates more than mechanical failure." I lifted a brow. "You planning to investigate a toaster?" "No," he said, finally opening his eyes. "But I shall keep my mind limber." That was Wolfe code for, "Put a pin in it, we may be needing it later." As it happened, we didn't need to wait long. 10 minutes later, the bell rang, and a woman stepped into the brownstone looking like anxiety had tailored her coat. I opened the door, and there she was, 30, maybe 32, tailored grey coat over an emerald blouse, clutching her purse like it contained state secrets. Her eyes scanned the foyer with suspicion, as though the coat rack might leap forward and accuse her. "Miss Calliope Van," she said, extending a hand. "I have an appointment with Mr. Wolfe." She didn't, but the look in her eyes made it clear that waiting wasn't on the table. I led her in, and she paused on the threshold like a tourist stepping into Versailles. Wolfe, who hadn't moved since the toaster verdict, regarded her over steepled fingers. "I believe," she said without preamble, "someone is trying to drive me insane using food." That got a response. Wolfe blinked once. "Sit," he said. "Explain." She sat, smoothed her skirt, and took a breath. "I work in advertising. Van and Bramble, high pressure, high stakes, and recently, highly strange." She explained that during a recent company retreat, small things began happening. Coffee with a bitter note, toast just this side of burnt, jam that tasted off. "Sounds like a continental breakfast in Jersey," I said. She didn't smile. "It's deliberate. Someone is orchestrating it. Yesterday, my toast came blackened, and it was the third time in 2 weeks. Wolfe frowned. This is not merely poor service. Number, it's coordinated. I believe it's psychological manipulation. It's a theory. Indeed, Wolfe said. And what do you call this theory? She looked at us both, voice firm now. The burnt toast theory, she said. The burnt toast theory, Calliope repeated as though she'd trademarked it. It's the idea that subtle culinary changes, errors that don't warrant confrontation, can be used to destabilize someone. I glanced at Wolfe. His fingers had twitched, an orchestra conductor, sensing the downbeat of a symphony he hadn't written but wanted to conduct. Calliope continued. Food is comfort. When it's repeatedly wrong in minor ways, it creates doubt. You feel unsettled. It makes you second-guess your senses. Wolfe sipped his beer. A form of psychological gaslighting, subtle, insidious. Exactly. At first I thought I was imagining it, but it's escalated. Others at the office noticed oddities. Baxter Bramble, our co-founder, calls it mental pressure seasoning. He laughs when he says it, but he watches everything. You suspect him? I don't know, it could be him. Or Marla Singh, she's our creative lead. Or Elliot Grimm, or all of them. Lem Hawkins, the caterer for the retreat, was evasive when I asked. Have you shared these suspicions? Wolfe asked. Calliope hesitated. Only with you. Wolfe leaned back. Miss Van, I do not chase shadows. But if someone is cooking with intention, we shall taste their motives in time. She smiled for the first time. He gestured toward me. Archie will begin by stirring the pot. I stood. I'd gone from toast to treachery in under an hour. And knowing Wolfe, this was just the appetizer. It took me a little under 2 hours to get from the brownstone to the 30th floor of the Van and Bramble building, with enough time on the way to pick up a clean shave and a new identity. I'd assumed the persona of one Jonathan Hale, an ambitious man from a boutique PR consultancy, looking to partner with a top-tier firm rooted in creative excellence, which I delivered with a straight face to the gum-chewing receptionist at the front desk. What made her buzz me through wasn't the pitch, it was the suit. I had the sense enough to wear charcoal grey, not black. Too many people think black makes you look important. It makes you look like you're trying too hard. The office was an open floor plan, tastefully modern, with glass panels and silent tension. People typed quietly, like they were afraid their keyboards might bite back. I was given a seat in a waiting area near the creative wing. From there, I watched and listened. No one said much, but their eyes did a lot of walking. A woman in tortoiseshell glasses passed me a brochure about brand elevation via aesthetic continuity. I thanked her politely, then flipped it open to hide the fact that I was watching a corner conversation between a thin man in a slate blue shirt and a woman who looked like she belonged in a high-end whiskey ad. He gestured with too much force. She smiled like it didn't touch her. A few minutes later, I was ushered into a glass office where the air smelled faintly of espresso and lemon polish. I introduced myself, handed over a fake card, and asked a few warm-up questions. Then I asked about the recent retreat. The smile froze. The espresso stayed warm, but the temperature dropped about 5 degrees. Baxter Bramble wasn't in, but Elliot Grimm was, junior partner, and from the look of him, a man who had spent his life under someone's shadow and was just about ready to start swinging at lampposts. I asked him how the retreat went. It was productive, he said, eyes narrowing. Bonding exercises, strategy sessions, and all the usual buzzwords. But the location, I prompted. I heard it was a converted farmhouse, chef on site. Grimm crossed his arms. Lem Hawkins does private events, a bit of a weirdo, but he's cheaper than the culinary agency types. And the food? He gave a short, mirthless laugh. What's this about? We planning a retreat with you? Just gathering impressions, I said smoothly. Calliope Van mentioned the food had inconsistencies. He flinched at the name. Van thinks too much, probably imagines her coffee's out to get her. Was it? He didn't answer. I waited. One of Wolfe's most effective strategies is silence. People rush to fill it, especially when they shouldn't. Grimm shifted. Fine, the toast was burnt. Twice. Coffee tasted off one morning, so what? You try cooking for 12 neurotic ad execs in the middle of nowhere. Things slip. Things like deliberate psychological sabotage. That earned a glare. You know, Van made quite a show of herself in front of the investors a few weeks ago. Took down Bramble's campaign pitch line by line, publicly. So she's not exactly a team player? She's too smart for the room and she knows it. Some people find that charming, others don't. That's when I knew there was something more to that retreat than team building. You don't get 3 mentions of burnt toast in 3 different tones of voice unless someone wants you to hear it. Burnt toast in this office wasn't a breakfast problem. It was a signal. When Bramble finally showed up, he had the stride of a man who expected the walls to part for him. Mid-40s, silver at the temples, blue eyes with the polite menace of a TV anchor. He looked me over as if measuring my market value, then smiled with teeth that knew how to sell. Jonathan Hale, yes, the synergy specialist. I nodded. I hear you're the creative juggernaut of Midtown. He waved me into his office, offered a glass of cucumber water, which I declined on principle, and asked me about cross-brand storytelling. I deflected artfully and asked about the team. Calliope's brilliant, he said. A bit esoteric. She believes in color psychology. Once redesigned a campaign because the shade of green made her anxious. And the others? He chuckled. Elliot's intense, eager to be taken seriously. He still thinks advertising is Mad Men. And Marla, well, Marla is Marla. Marla Singh entered just then, as if summoned by narrative timing. Early 30s, poised and dressed in a sharply tailored indigo pantsuit that made the office fluorescent seem expensive. Her smile was cinematic. "Talking about me again, Baxter?" she said. "Always," Bramble replied, gesturing toward me. "Jonathan Hale, strategic branding consultant." "Charmed," she said, holding out a hand with lacquered nails like gleaming punctuation marks. "Hope you're here to fix our logo. It's due for a breakdown." "I thought it had already been redesigned," she smiled. "Oh, I don't mean graphically, I mean emotionally." I liked her immediately, which meant I didn't trust her. She perched on the edge of Bramble's desk like a socialite cat. "You're looking into the retreat, aren't you?" "Just a cultural overview," I said. Her eyes glinted. "We're a culture of barely contained ambition, with a side of toast." No one laughed. I left that office with a mental dossier on 3 suspects, 1 brittle, 1 ambitious, and 1 playing God with sugar packets. And not a one of them could toast bread without burning something else, an ego, a grudge, or maybe something far more fatal. Next stop, Wolfe, time to serve the crumbs. Lem Hawkins didn't look like a man who made a living feeding other people. His frame was angular, like someone who hadn't sampled his own cuisine in years, and his hands bore the calluses of hard labor, not refined plating. He met me in a cramped commercial kitchen he rented in Hell's Kitchen, where he prepped for retreats and events. The air smelled of vinegar and burnt fennel. "I don't usually talk to suits," he said, which would have stung if I hadn't been wearing a sweater vest under protest. "Lucky for both of us, I'm not one," I replied. "I'm curious about what happened at the Van and Bramble retreat." He leaned on the counter. "They were a twitchy bunch. Corporate types are always more high maintenance than they realize." "So you served them burnt toast?" He smiled, slow, wary. "That wasn't me. That was Bramble's idea." "Explain." He reached for a worn satchel and pulled out a tattered retreat schedule. It included an item labeled Leadership Reflection Breakfast, optional demonstration. He brought his own bread, Lem said. Wanted to illustrate something about tolerance for imperfection. Burnt the first slice on purpose. Gave a speech about how people react under pressure. Then he handed the toast to Calliope and asked her how it made her feel. That sounds less like a breakfast and more like a mind game. Exactly. It wasn't about food, it was about control. He called it flavor framing. He said discomfort is a branding opportunity. I leaned back. And did Calliope seem affected? She laughed, but the kind of laugh that wants to kill something. And the others? Grim looked sick. Marla pretended it was brilliant. I just wanted to finish poaching the eggs. I thanked him, left him to his vinegar, and made a note. Burnt toast wasn't the byproduct of a bad breakfast. It was a symbol, a signal, possibly a threat. If someone in that office was using food to play head games, they were following a recipe. And Wolfe, I knew, was about to start reading it. By the time I got back, it was early evening, and Fritz had resumed his culinary dignity with a veal tenderloin that nearly made me forget about psychological warfare via toaster. Wolfe was in the office, beer in hand, eyes closed as if the world outside didn't merit his vision. I briefed him, Calliope's co-workers, the retreat's ambiance, Grim's grudge, Marla's polish, Bramble's breakfast theatre, and Lem's reluctant witness account. He opened his eyes only once at the mention of Bramble's toast demonstration. Flavor framing, I said. He claimed discomfort enhances brand memory. Hogwash, Wolfe muttered. That belongs in the same category as edible marketing and intellectual mayonnaise. But effective, I said. The toast wasn't random, it was intentional, directed, controlled. He nodded slowly. Manipulation, by ritualized error. An unsettling hypothesis, but not implausible. I passed him the schedule from Lem. He glanced over it, eyebrows arched. A man who introduces deliberate imperfection under the guise of leadership is not merely arrogant, he is dangerous. Because of the toast? Because of what it implies, he said. It is not nourishment, it is theatre, wielded like a scalpel. I didn't bother asking if he believed Calliope now. The fact that he hadn't dismissed her as delusional meant she had passed the Wolfe filter. Have Saul find out how sharp that scalpel is, Wolfe said finally. Let's see what Bramble slices when no one's looking. I called Saul just after 9. He was finishing a tail job in Yonkers but agreed to drop by Bramble's penthouse before midnight and report back. Wolfe gave him 2 instructions: follow Bramble discreetly and find out everything he could about Lem Hawkins' history, especially where he learned to cook and who else he cooked for. He is the link, Wolfe said. The cook observes more than he serves. If Bramble used him as a tool, it must be documented. If he resisted, it may explain the urgency. I knew Saul wouldn't ask questions. He preferred answers. And if there were threads in Bramble's apartment, or in Lem's past, Saul would unravel them. As I hung up, I looked at Wolfe. He'd closed his eyes again, fingertips pressed beneath his chin, an expression I recognized from 100 cases. He wasn't brooding, he was seasoning, and whatever he was cooking up, someone was about to get served. Saul Panzer doesn't call me in the middle of the night unless something's dead, dying, or making a convincing impression of either. This time, it was door number 1. I'm at Lem Hawkins' apartment, he said. You'll want to see it. I was already grabbing my coat. Saul wasn't one for dramatics, which is probably why his tone did more than a siren could. By the time I reached the dimly lit hallway outside Hawkins' 3rd-floor walk-up in the East 70s, Saul was waiting with the door ajar and an expression I'd seen on him only twice before, once when he found a banker hanging from his own necktie, and once when he opened a freezer that didn't contain frozen peas. The smell hit me first, burnt toast with a hint of brewed coffee, overlain with something sharper. Lem Hawkins was in the kitchen. He wasn't cooking. He was slumped over the counter, head tilted at an angle that anatomy books would object to. The toaster was still on, charring a forgotten slice into ash. A coffee maker burbled cheerfully beside him, unaware it was now performing in a murder scene. Saul pointed to the floor. A small canister lay tipped on its side, fine white powder spilled across the tiles like a warning. On the counter, amid the detritus of breakfast, was a piece of paper with handwriting that would have passed muster in any lunatic's diary. The theory was right. No signs of struggle, Saul said. No forced entry. No bruising. Cops'll say heart failure or accident, maybe suicide. Yeah, I said, except for the toast, the note, and the not-so-fun dip-and-sip powder. Saul nodded toward the window. Back entrance, fire escape, unlocked. I took it in. It looked clean, too clean. Lem had been cautious, paranoid even. He cooked for people who didn't care for witnesses. He hadn't planned to die that morning. And something told me that toast wasn't just overdone, it was symbolic, just like Calliope Van had warned. I gave the place the kind of once-over that stops short of contaminating evidence, but still satisfies a man's curiosity. The cops hadn't arrived yet. Saul had a knack for showing up in that golden pre-squad window, and I knew Wolfe would want eyes before uniforms muddied the picture. The setup was domestic, tidy, too efficient for a man like Lem Hawkins, who lived like a man always preparing for his next booking. A stack of catering invoices lay near the fridge. 2 were unpaid. A set of prep knives gleamed on a magnetized strip, untouched. Nothing was out of place, except Lem. The powder was the obvious outlier. A white, crystalline dust, half spilled, half measured. No label on the canister. But Saul had already collected a small sample in a wax envelope, which he handed to me with the gravity of a priest passing a relic. No signs of food tampering in the fridge, he said, but the coffee beans were pre-ground, sealed tight. And the toast? Burnt to hell, on purpose. That last part stuck. I examined the note again. The theory was right. This wasn't suicide, I muttered. No, Saul said. This was a performance. The kind of performance Lem had seen once too often, perhaps. Wolfe had always maintained that cooks and waiters made the best observers, unnoticed, underestimated, and always watching. If someone had used Lem's own tools to send a message, it wasn't just to remove him, it was to punctuate something. The same way Bramble had used burnt toast at the retreat, only this time the stakes weren't theoretical. They were lethal. I looked at Saul. You're heading to the brownstone? Already on my way. I stayed behind. I had a few more details to soak in before the cavalry arrived. And besides, I wanted one more look at that toaster. By the time I returned to the brownstone, the sun hadn't yet cleared the skyline, but Fritz was already in the kitchen preparing eggs à la truffe, blissfully unaware of the latest murder linked to burnt toast. I let him be. Some things are sacred. Wolfe, on the other hand, was waiting. I presented the note, the powder sample, and the scene's particulars. His eyes flicked to the words. The theory was right. That, he said, is not the handwriting of a man confessing guilt. It is a declaration. Declaration of what? That he was correct, likely not about himself, about the method. He took the wax envelope delicately. This? Unlabeled. White. Odorless. I didn't taste it. Nor should you, he said dryly. Fritz has more useful applications for your tongue. He rose, an event that rarely occurred before noon, and made for the lab. Yes, Wolfe had a lab, not a sprawling, bubbling chemical nightmare, but a dignified setup where poisons, spices, and rare fungi could be compared with the discretion of a Jesuit. 10 minutes later, he returned. It's a nootropic. A what? A cognitive stimulant derived from a European compound. Enhances clarity, short-term memory, useless in high doses, dangerous when exposed to heat. You're saying it becomes toxic if toasted? He nodded. The compound breaks down when subjected to heat and alters neurochemical pathways, leads to seizures or respiratory failure. I blinked. And Lem sprinkled it near his toaster. No, Wolfe said, settling back into his chair. Someone else did. Lem wouldn't have made that mistake. He stared at the note again. This is not about food, he murmured. It is about control. And just like that, the burnt toast wasn't the mystery. It was the murder weapon. Wolfe set the envelope on his desk like it contained the Magna Carta and leaned back, fingers meeting just beneath his chin. He was silent for a moment, which, as any observer of his habits could tell you, was the sound of gears grinding at a velocity that would have startled a locomotive. I am familiar with this compound, he said finally. It is a derivative of phenyltrivaxine, originally manufactured by a pharmaceutical consortium in Belgium for the treatment of short-term cognitive decline. Mild in microdoses, volatile when adulterated, and toxic when heated, I added. He nodded. Its molecular structure becomes unstable at 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The resulting compound, Trivaxol-, disrupts the central nervous system, hallucinations, spasms, eventual cardiac arrest. Death mimics seizure or overdose. Unless one knows precisely what to test for, it vanishes post-mortem. I let out a low whistle. So Lem didn't just toast his breakfast, someone toasted his brain. Wolfe frowned. Crude, but essentially correct. He was murdered. And the note? A message. He recognized the method being used, perhaps not the precise agent, but the pattern. He understood, too late, that the theory had moved from the abstract to the lethal. Then we're done with metaphors, I said. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. We are done with coincidence. Miss Van may be paranoid, but her fears now reside in the province of fact. That was Wolfe's version of a call to arms, or rather, a call to sit perfectly still while others moved strategically around him. It wasn't until later that evening, just after dinner, braised duck, subtle and satisfying, though I found myself eyeing the toast with residual suspicion, that Fritz entered the office and lingered with the kind of posture that meant something had been left unsaid. Wolfe noticed instantly. Yes, he prompted. Fritz cleared his throat. I hadn't thought of it earlier, but you mentioned Lem Hawkins, and it stirred something. Go on, Wolfe said. Fritz hesitated, an event rarer than Wolfe leaving the house. Years ago I was invited to contribute to a publication, a European private printing. The title was Essays in Culinary Psychology. I declined. It was too abstract. But the man organizing it was Lem. Wolfe's eyebrows lifted a millimeter. That counted as a jolt. You're certain? Yes, it was 2009. He had just returned from Zurich, where he'd been cooking for a private club. They weren't just gourmets, they were intellectuals, behavioral scientists. They believed food could be used to influence emotion, mood engineering through meals. I blinked. Like flavor-based mind control? Fritz shot me a disapproving look. They preferred the term sensory persuasion. Wolfe was quiet for a long beat. So Lem was not merely a cook, he murmured. He was a theoretician. And now he's toast, I muttered. Neither of them dignified that. Wolfe looked thoughtful. Zurich, that's a city with shadows, and Miss Van's Mr. Bramble seems quite fond of casting them. The term theory had always irritated Wolfe. In his view, it implied an abstraction, an indulgence of intellectual laziness. A proper deduction was not a theory, it was a conclusion, verified, reproducible, and ideally irrefutable. But that night, he didn't sneer at the term. He examined it. "The burnt toast theory," he repeated softly, as if now tasting it with new palate. Calliope's initial description had seemed fanciful, manipulation through toast. But now, with Lem dead, a neurotoxin in the kitchen, and a trail leading to Zurich's behavioral elite, it was no longer whimsical. It was structured, codified, executed. "Someone," Wolfe said slowly, "has taken a hypothesis about culinary influence and weaponized it. Not merely for discomfort, not for marketing, for domination." "Psychological warfare at the breakfast table," I said. "Precisely. Miss Van was the next subject, but Lem's resistance, his refusal to play further, made him inconvenient." "You think Bramble's behind it?" "Bramble is the front," Wolfe murmured. "Whoever is orchestrating this prefers misdirection. Control through food is subtle, and so must be the puppet master." I leaned back. "What's our next move?" He closed his eyes. "We feed them their own dish. But first, Saul must find out what else Lem brought back from Zurich, and I want that cookbook. Essays in Culinary Psychology." I made a note. And then I made another. If someone was baking madness into toast, we were going to need more than Fritz's apron to survive this menu. When I stepped into the Van and Bramble offices again, Elliot Grimm looked like a man who'd been living on espresso and resentment. His collar was wilted, his eyes bloodshot, and his temper riding a hair trigger. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I just shut the door to his glass-walled office and leaned in like a man with time and motive. "We need to talk about Bramble's breakfasts," I said. He blinked. "I don't follow." "Oh, I think you do. Toast demonstrations, coffee tampering, mood-based menus. All very avant-garde until someone dies." He swallowed. "You're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything. But Lem Hawkins is dead. You knew he was the caterer at your retreat, and you know what Bramble was doing with him." Grimm hesitated, then dropped into his chair like a puppet whose strings had been clipped. "It was Bramble's idea," he said. "He wanted to test resilience. He believed that controlling food during high-stress events revealed underlying loyalty patterns." I raised an eyebrow. "Loyalty patterns?" He read some Swiss journal on behavioral response to sensory disruption, said the smallest breach, burnt toast, undersalted soup, was more revealing than a personality assessment. So he experimented with staff. Yes, and with clients too, in focus groups. "And Lem?" "Lem didn't like it, said it violated culinary ethics. Bramble threatened to replace him. Eventually Lem agreed, but only for the retreat. After that, he stopped taking calls." I let that sit for a second. "You didn't think to warn anyone?" "I didn't know it had gone that far. I thought it was just a game, a manipulative, smug, Bramble brand game. Except now your cook is dead, and someone's tampering with coffee beans." Grimm's lips thinned. "I never liked the theory." "Maybe. But someone did." He dropped his gaze, and I knew I had what I needed. Now it was Wolfe's move. Back at the brownstone, Saul Panzer was already in the office when I returned. He had that "I've got something" look in his eyes, which, for Saul, meant only a slight narrowing of the lids and the faintest upward quirk of his mouth. "I found a few items worth your attention," he said, taking the seat across from Wolfe. Lem Hawkins was on the payroll of a Zurich-based think tank from 2008 to 2010. The official name was Institute für Sensorische Innovation, but it operated under several aliases. Their mission was to explore behavioral response through culinary input. Wolfe grunted. They ran a controlled experiment series called The Flavor of Trust. Participants were unknowingly subjected to altered food, burnt toast, spoiled milk, flat soda, to evaluate resilience and susceptibility to suggestion. Wolfe's fingers steepled. And Hawkins' role? He was head chef and protocol designer. When he returned to the States, he cut all ties. No publications, no interviews. But 2 years ago, Bramble contacted him. I found the emails. "Let me guess," I said. "He wanted Lem to recreate the experiments." Saul nodded. "Called it applied influence training." Lem declined. But eventually, under financial pressure, he agreed to a limited engagement, just the retreat. Wolfe's expression didn't shift, but I knew he was absorbing every syllable. "And Bramble?" "Too clean," Saul said. "No notes, no trail. He pays in cash or through holding companies. But one document turned up, a catering invoice with the words Behavioral Package C handwritten in the corner." Wolfe muttered, "Fools and their grandiosity." It was becoming clear. Someone had decided to repurpose psychological culinary theory into corporate strategy and had added a dash of lethality to the mix. But who was the chef now? I was halfway through noting down Saul's findings when Inspector Kramer made his grand entrance. No knock, just the usual gust of sarcasm and cigar smoke. Wolfe looked up, but didn't rise. "You're early. And you're involved," Kramer growled, planting himself in the red armchair like he intended to wrestle it into a confession. "We were expecting your call," Wolfe said mildly. Kramer waved a folder. "Lem Hawkins, found dead with a note, burnt toast, and a powdered substance we're still trying to identify. But here's the kicker. The neighbor says a thin guy with sharp eyes came around just before the squad cars." "Saul," I said helpfully. Kramer turned his glare on Saul, who gave him the kind of look reserved for telemarketers and parking attendants. "You working the case?" Kramer demanded. "I'm observing," Saul replied. "Fine. Then you can observe from a bench if you interfere again." Wolfe cleared his throat. "Inspector, I assure you, Saul is merely gathering data at my request, which, as you've no doubt discovered, tends to be more accurate than departmental guesswork." Kramer snorted. "That note, the theory was right." "What the hell does that mean?" Wolfe said nothing. I leaned back. "You ever get a piece of toast too burnt to eat, Inspector?" Kramer blinked. "What's that got to do with—" "It means everything," Wolfe said. Kramer scowled. "This better not be one of your stunts, Wolfe." "It's not," Wolfe said, steepling his fingers again. "It's murder by persuasion." Kramer stood, huffed, and left. But I knew Wolfe well enough to see it. He'd just baited the hook, and someone, very soon, was going to bite. The next revelation came, as many did in our brownstone, by way of Fritz Brenner, unwilling, uncomfortable, and culinary in origin. He came into the office just after lunch, towel still over one arm, posture stiff. That usually meant someone had insulted a bechamel or dared question his mushroom reduction. But this time, the discomfort ran deeper. "Mr. Wolfe," he began, voice more formal than usual, "there is something I ought to tell you. I didn't earlier because, well, I didn't think it mattered. But now, it might." Wolfe looked up from the orchid journal on his lap. "If it pertains to Lem Hawkins, speak." "It does," Fritz said. "Roughly 3 years ago, Lem contacted me with a proposition. He said he was assembling a collaborative manuscript, a book. Not recipes, precisely. More culinary theory." Wolfe's brows lifted a degree. "Go on." "It was called The Influential Palate, a privately published work, half cookbook, half behavioral science. The thesis was that food could be used as a psychological instrument, not just to soothe or provoke, but to manipulate." I whistled. "Heavy seasoning?" Fritz didn't smile. He asked me to contribute a section. Passive resistance through kitchen consistency, he called it. I declined. It felt wrong. Wolfe nodded slowly. Do you know who accepted? Only one name I recall. Bramble. Baxter Bramble. He'd attended one of Lem's Zurich demonstrations. Was fascinated, apparently. Said he wanted to push it further. I looked at Wolfe, who was now fully alert. Fritz continued. Lem said Bramble insisted on his own annotated copy. With margin notes, Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Then I want that copy. Fritz bowed slightly and departed, leaving behind more than just a trace of roasted garlic. Wolfe sat in silence a moment longer, then murmured, The book holds the blueprint. But the notes, those may hold the motive. Saul arrived shortly after Fritz's confession, which made timing one of the few things not manipulated in this case. Wolfe wasted no time. Saul, I need a copy of a book, a very specific copy, unpublished, private printing, title, The Influential Palette. Saul nodded. Author? Compiled by Lem Hawkins, but I want the annotated copy that was sent to Baxter Bramble. I believe it exists. Saul didn't blink. If it exists, I'll find it. Good. If Bramble's version has marginalia, capture every line, photograph it. I want the ink, the fingerprints, the insights. And if it's not in his home, then search his office, his safe, his vault, his mind if necessary. Saul tilted his head. Quietly? Of course, I don't want Kramer seeing it until we've read it. Saul rose, paused, then said, One more thing. Lem's financials show a one-time wire transfer from Bramble's holding company last month. 5 figures. Wolfe nodded as if the final seasoning had been stirred into his reduction. Payment for silence, or compliance. Either way, the meal turned bitter. As Saul left, Wolfe turned to me. Archie, when Saul returns, I want that book translated aloud, cover to cover. Sounds like a thrilling evening. Better than dinner with Bramble, he said. I couldn't argue with that. As the hours passed and the house returned to its usual rhythm, I found myself revisiting Grimm, his panicked eyes, his twitchy confessions, the way his voice cracked when he said, I thought it was just a game. It had the shape of guilt, sure. But guilt wasn't the same as murder. Still, I laid it out to Wolfe while he sat in the office, hands folded like he was brokering peace between 2 hostile nations. I'm telling you, I said, Grimm is unstable, nervous, volatile. If someone slipped Lem that powder, Grimm had motive. Wolfe's eyelids fluttered, which in wolf speak meant disdain. No, Archie. No. Grimm is a balloon. He expands when pricked, but has no internal mechanism to guide him. He resents Bramble, yes. He may even despise Miss Van, but he is incapable of orchestration. He cracked quick enough. Indeed, which makes him useful but not dangerous. He is a man of emotional combustion, not strategic temperament. So what is he then? A red herring, as you Americans say. No spine, no subtlety, no capacity for measured cruelty. He could have helped without knowing. Delivered the powder, made a comment. Wolfe raised a hand. Stop! Grimm is incidental. Bramble is deliberate. He leaned forward. And I do not like deliberate men who burn toast for demonstration. That, I knew, was Wolfe's version of a gauntlet thrown, and if Bramble didn't trip over it soon, we'd make sure he did. Saul returned just after 10, which by Wolfe's standards was the dead of night. I offered him coffee, which he declined. He looked as though he'd consumed enough caffeine and subterfuge to fuel a congressional subcommittee. I found it, he said, placing a slender volume on Wolfe's desk. The original copy, annotated in Bramble's own hand. Wolfe regarded it like a judge receiving a deposition. The book was titled The Influential Palette, Notes on Culinary Leverage, minimalist cover, no ISBN, The kind of printing that didn't go through publishing houses, only through whisper networks. Saul opened it to a flagged page. This is the section Lem authored. I leaned over to read. A subtle culinary flaw, when introduced repetitively, has measurable effects on subject confidence, memory, and autonomy. The subject's trust in external stimuli erodes. Reaction time slows. Paranoia increases. Saul pointed to the margin. Bramble's handwriting was precise, almost surgical. Try with toast. Early morning reinforcement. Establish pattern. Wolfe didn't speak, but his fingers tapped once, slow and deliberate. Another page, another annotation. Lem had written, ethical boundary. When culinary disruption becomes intentional deception, the cook assumes the role of manipulator, not nourisher. And beside it, in Bramble's hand, so the objective is performance, not nourishment. Wolfe closed the book gently. It is all here, he said. Intent, method, justification. This is not culinary philosophy, it is strategy. I folded my arms. Lem resisted, so Bramble eliminated the liability. And Miss Van, Wolfe mused, the next phase of the experiment, or a more satisfying target. Because she mocked him, because she did not submit. There was no triumph in Wolfe's tone, only gravity. He tapped the book once more. This is not theory anymore, Archie. It is a doctrine. Wolfe kept the book open on his desk like a general reviewing battle maps. Each margin note, each crossed-out phrase, revealed Bramble's mind, not a chaotic fury like Grimm's, but a cold and curated resolve. Burnt toast, he said, is the initial breach. I raised an eyebrow. A bit subtle, even for psychological sabotage. He looked up. That is precisely its strength. Its power lies in its triviality. No one complains about one imperfect slice, but 3, 5, a week's worth. One begins to distrust their own senses. And then? The progression is deliberate. Bitterness in the coffee, oversalted soup, lukewarm tea. The subject begins questioning their preferences, their autonomy, their grasp of routine. Sounds more like a bad hotel breakfast than a behavioral assault. Wolfe allowed himself a fractional smile. It is the accumulation that works the damage, and Bramble is not merely a consumer of these ideas. He is a practitioner. He refined Lem's theory into a system. He tapped the margin note again. Try with toast. Start the collapse early, I murmured. Undermine them before they dress for work.
Exactly. And note, Calliope's suspicions began at the retreat, but intensified after she humiliated Bramble in public. He escalated. I nodded. And Lem? A variable he couldn't control. A liability. A witness. Wolfe leaned back. The burnt toast wasn't a coincidence. It was a signal, the theory's opening move. And the poisoned coffee? The checkmate. He looked at me now, eyes narrowed. I do not like men who experiment on people before breakfast. Neither did I. The next morning, I asked Miss Van to return to the brownstone. She arrived promptly, crisp and controlled as ever, but I could tell the edges were fraying. Her coat was perfect, but her grip on her handbag was a little too tight, like it was anchoring her to the moment. Wolfe waited until she was seated before speaking. Miss Van, we would like to revisit your interaction with Mr. Bramble, particularly the incident in which you publicly challenged him. She blinked. At the investor briefing? Yes, she sighed. That was 6 weeks ago. He presented a new branding framework. I found it derivative and said so on stage. I thought I was being honest, perhaps a little pointed. Your tone? Professional, but not reverent. Baxter doesn't appreciate irreverence. He would not. Wolfe steepled his fingers. What followed? She hesitated. Nothing. Overt. But things began to shift. At the next retreat, my coffee was unusually bitter. My lunch arrived late. My toast, well, we've discussed that. Was the pattern consistent? Yes, every day, different meals, different errors, but always something. And did you confront anyone? I asked Lem. He said he'd look into it. The next morning things were better, but only for a day. Then it resumed. Wolfe was silent. She leaned forward. You think it wasn't a coincidence? I think, Wolfe said, you became the subject of an experiment you did not consent to. Her eyes widened. My God. Indeed. Bramble used Lem's theories, adapted them, abused them. She sat back, eyes distant. I thought I was losing focus, she whispered. That maybe I was imagining things. Wolfe's voice was very quiet. That, Miss Van, was the point. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of confirmation. Wolfe, still seated with the influential palette open before him like scripture, now spoke as if delivering a lecture at the Sorbonne. We are no longer dealing with a theory in trial phase, he said. This is implementation. I leaned back in my chair. You mean Bramble is rolling it out like a product? Worse, Wolfe replied. He is refining it. He tapped a chart sketched on a notepad, columns labelled entry point, culinary trigger, observed response, and subject status. I believe Lem's private annotations and Bramble's marginalia outline the stages. The subject is first exposed to minor disturbances, burnt toast, off-temperature coffee. Repetition triggers emotional agitation. Then, the next phase escalates, disruptions in texture, seasoning, consistency. The subject begins to question memory and reliability. And after that, isolation. Foods arrive late. Incorrect orders, a social component, implying negligence or sabotage from colleagues. That breeds paranoia. Charming breakfast program, I muttered. Wolfe's gaze didn't waver. Miss Van was subjected to this full sequence. We are fortunate she sought help when she did. Another few weeks and her credibility would have eroded. And Lem? Lem understood too well. He refused to participate further. That made him a liability. I glanced at the note again. The theory was right. Lem saw the pattern, I said. Wolfe nodded once. And paid for it. I didn't need a blueprint to understand the next move. Bramble hadn't just been testing the theory, he'd been documenting it. And somewhere in Calliope's life, I was willing to bet we'd find proof that someone had gone from mind games to high-stakes sabotage. That afternoon, at Wolfe's suggestion, with his precise phrasing being, Archie, go tear apart Miss Van's kitchen with discretion, I paid a visit to Calliope's apartment. She lived in a tastefully furnished walk-up in the East 30s. Lots of muted grey brass accents and a faint aroma of citrus and paperbacks. It didn't scream paranoia, but it whispered it. She let me in and stood to the side, watching as I began what she graciously called an audit, and what I accurately called a snoop. The kitchen was pristine, save for a few signs of rapid living. A half-eaten protein bar, 2 empty coffee mugs in the sink, and a mason jar of what looked like gourmet quinoa past its prime. I started with the dry goods cabinet. Top shelf, flour, rice, lentils. Middle, pasta, couscous, 3 tins of imported sardines. Bottom, coffee beans, unopened. It was behind the coffee canister that I found it. A small black device, rectangular, no bigger than a matchbox, not visible from eye level, taped to the inside of the shelf.
A pinhole microphone with a wireless transmitter, battery still warm. I turned to Calliope. You've been bugged? She stared, then blinked. Who would... Someone who wanted to monitor your reactions. Reactions to what? To toast and everything else. I bagged the device, made a note to have Saul trace the signal frequency, and asked if she'd received any recent deliveries, coffee especially. She pointed to the beans. Those came from Marla. She said they were a peace offering. If that was a peace offering, I'd hate to see her idea of war. I left with the bug, the beans, and a question. Was Marla the chef behind the sabotage, or just the server? Back at the brownstone, Wolfe didn't look up when I entered. He was reviewing Bramble's annotated copy of the influential palette, muttering Latin phrases under his breath that likely didn't mean bon appetit. I placed the bug on his desk and handed over the coffee beans. He opened the bag, gave it a cautious sniff, then summoned Fritz. "Bring me a clean dish and the testing kit." 20 minutes later, Wolfe confirmed what we both suspected. "Trivaxol dash," he said. "Same compound that killed Hawkins." "Calliope never opened it," I said. "Marla gave it to her last week." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Then Miss Singh is no longer a supporting character. She's on stage." Just then Saul arrived holding a folder. "Email metadata," he said. "The one Grimm supposedly sent to Lem telling him to shut up or else. It's fake. Trace the IP. Originated from a spoofing app on Marla's work laptop." I whistled low. So Marla framed Grimm to misdirect suspicion, slipped Calliope poisoned beans to finish the job, and helped Bramble orchestrate the entire scheme. Saul nodded. She also handled all the logistics for the retreat. Lem wouldn't have cooked a meal unless she said it was approved. Wolfe closed the book with finality. "Then we have our co-conspirator." "But who's the lead?" I asked. Wolfe tapped the bug. "Marla placed the tools. Bramble selected the targets." "And Lem?" "A test subject who refused to play his part." I looked at the coffee beans, suddenly very awake. "We have enough?" "We do," Wolfe said. "Now, Archie, invite our guests." I raised an eyebrow. "Tea and toast?" Wolfe smiled faintly. "With restraint, but not mercy." It wasn't quite breakfast, and it certainly wasn't brunch, but Fritz had laid out the table in the dining room with the solemnity of a ceremonial inquisition. Tea service gleamed in polished silver. Toast, sliced, golden, unburnt, rested on bone china plates. There was butter, soft and precise, and a small pot of Calliope's coffee beans, roasted and untouched. Wolfe had given me the list. I'd made the calls. At 6:45 sharp, our guests arrived in sequence, as if stage-managed. Bramble first, crisp navy suit, smile like a monogram. Then Marla, sleek and unreadable, all angles and poise. Elliot Grimm slouched in 10 minutes late, eyes hollow. Calliope arrived last, guarded but steady. And behind them all, trailing cigar smoke and suspicion, came Inspector Kramer. "I trust," Wolfe said, "you will indulge me." They seated themselves around the table. Fritz poured tea, I served toast. No one touched it at first. Wolfe sat at the head, serene as a monk, watching the room like a chessboard he'd already solved. "This," he said, gesturing at the table, "is not hospitality." "It is an exercise," Bramble chuckled. "I've heard of power lunches, but power tea? Clever." Wolfe inclined his head. "Indeed, and more potent than one assumes." The toast remained untouched. Calliope looked from her plate to Bramble. "I assume this isn't about catering critiques?" she said. "No," Wolfe replied. "It is about psychological warfare, through crumbs." Bramble smiled wider. "Ah, we're discussing breakfast as battlefield?" "Among other things." Kramer grunted. "Get on with it, Wolfe." "I intend to." But first, he let the silence settle like steam over porcelain. I watched Marla glance toward the coffee, then away. Bramble crossed one leg over the other, a man waiting to be amused, but they were already being tested, and the results were in. Bramble leaned forward, plucking a slice of toast from the plate and turning it slowly in his fingers as if inspecting the grain pattern might reveal meaning. "You know," he said casually, "I've always found breakfast fascinating. The ritual of it. It's the most intimate meal, yet the most overlooked. People are unguarded, exposed. He paused, letting the word hang like a smirk. Dominance by breakfast, he added. Delicious, no? Kramer snorted. That's supposed to be witty. Calliope looked like she wanted to throw the teapot at him. Marla kept her eyes on her cup, but her fingers trembled slightly as she stirred. Wolfe didn't blink. Thank you for confirming. Bramble arched an eyebrow. Confirming what? That you are a man who enjoys manipulation dressed as charm. I stood behind Wolfe, arms folded, letting the air thicken. Bramble laughed. If you invited us for brunch and amateur philosophy, I'll be on my way. No, Wolfe said. You will stay? Because the philosophy in question now includes homicide. That silenced him. Not dramatically, but with an audible click of recalibration. Kramer leaned forward. You accusing someone, Wolfe? In time, Marla spoke then, softly. This is absurd. We're not criminals. We're advertisers. Indeed, Wolfe said. You sell perception. Today, you failed to control it. Bramble placed the toast back on the plate with exaggerated delicacy. Then perhaps, he said coolly, you'd like to present your own narrative, since we seem to be assembled for a story hour. Oh, Wolfe replied, voice like velvet over steel. I intend to. And now that the curtain was up, Wolfe reached for his book of truth, annotated in malice and murder. Wolfe shifted in his chair, rarely a casual gesture. He lifted the annotated copy of the influential palette and placed it at the center of the table, facing Bramble. This, he said, is not a cookbook. It is a blueprint, and you, Mr. Bramble, are its most devoted architect. Bramble's smile shrank a quarter inch. Wolfe continued, burnt toast, bitter coffee, undersalted soup. These were not accidents. They were calculated steps in what you call the flavor framework of influence. Calliope stiffened. Grimm looked ill. Wolfe turned a page. Here, your note. Try with toast. Early morning reinforcement. You understood what Lem Hawkins theorized. You appropriated it, refined it, and deployed it against colleagues. Bramble opened his mouth. Wolfe raised a finger. Not yet. You'll have your turn. He turned to Calliope. After you embarrassed Mr. Bramble, you began experiencing inconsistencies in your meals arranged, confirmed, or delivered through channels overseen by Miss Singh. Marla flinched. You began to question your memory, your routine. These are the documented psychological effects of sustained culinary disruption. Lem tried to protect you. Then abruptly, he died. Kramer leaned forward. You saying Bramble killed him? I am saying Lem's death was staged to appear accidental, using a heat-reactive nootropic compound embedded in his coffee. The same powder was later found, unopened, in coffee beans gifted to Miss Van. He turned to Saul, who stepped forward and laid the transmitter, retrieved from Calliope's pantry, on the table. And someone was listening. Wolfe's gaze moved to Marla. You handled the logistics, you planted the bug, and you forged an email from Grimm to Lem, a frame designed to shield Bramble. Marla's mouth opened, then shut. Bramble, now pale, pushed back his chair. This is speculation, he said weakly. No, Wolfe said calmly. It is deduction, and your marginalia provided the motive. Wolfe steepled his fingers. You didn't just test the theory, you believed in it, you worshipped it. And like most zealots, he'd offered up a human sacrifice. We were just here to read the recipe aloud. Wolfe gestured toward the silver canister on the sideboard, the one Fritz had retrieved with tongs and gloved hands. Inspector, he said, turning to Kramer, the coffee beans in this container were delivered to Miss Van by Miss Singh, allegedly as a peace offering. Kramer grunted. So? So, Wolfe replied. They contained trace amounts of Trivaxyl D, the same heat-sensitive compound found in the body of Lem Hawkins. Marla's spoon dropped into her teacup with an audible clink. Bramble remained still, but his jaw tightened. "Not enough to kill with a single cup," Wolfe continued, "but sufficient to degrade cognition and sow paranoia over time." Kramer's eyes narrowed. "And you can prove it came from her?" Wolfe inclined his head toward Saul, who handed over a printed report. Digital correspondence, a delivery receipt, and a note, unsigned but sent from Miss Singh's personal account. Calliope stiffened. "I didn't drink it," she said quietly. "I didn't trust it." "A wise instinct," Wolfe said. "Miss Singh, would you care to explain?" Marla's lips parted, then closed again. Her hands gripped the edge of her plate as though it might keep her upright. Wolfe let the silence drag just long enough. "You see," he continued, "Miss Singh's role was not to poison, it was to prepare the palate, to deliver the dish. Bramble composed the recipe, she plated it." Bramble scoffed. "Now we're doing metaphors again?" "No," Wolfe said. "Now we're doing murder." Marla Singh was many things, ambitious, poised, practiced, but under Wolfe's scrutiny the lacquer began to flake. "You're insane," she whispered. "All of this, it's conjecture." Wolfe remained motionless. "On the contrary, it is analysis, supported by documents, chemical evidence, and motive." Bramble broke in, voice sharp. "Even if any of this were true, which it isn't, it proves nothing. Lem's death was ruled accidental, or you're just stringing together breadcrumbs." I couldn't help myself. "That's the problem when you leave a trail." Wolfe ignored me. "You tested the theory, Mr. Bramble, but you were not content with disruption. You wanted confirmation. You wanted obedience. And when Miss Van humiliated you in front of the board, I improved her discipline," Bramble snapped. Marla flinched at that. "That," Wolfe said softly, "is what you told her, isn't it? That the theory wasn't abuse, it was calibration." Marla's fingers tightened. I didn't know it would go that far." "You forged an email to implicate Grimm, planted a listening device, delivered a neurotoxin." "I thought it was just part of the test." He said, Wolfe raised his voice, just a hair. "He said Lem would understand, that he'd comply, but Lem didn't. So he died." Kramer stood. "That's enough. You two are coming with me." Bramble turned to him, incredulous. "This is preposterous." "Then you'll enjoy proving it downtown," Kramer growled. Wolfe reached for his beer. "I find," he said, "that some breakfasts are best digested in custody." They were gone. Kramer, Bramble, Marla, swept into the arms of justice, or at least the back seat of a black sedan with poor suspension. Wolfe sat in his chair, still as sculpture, hands resting on the arms like he was ruling from a throne. I cleared the table, one buttered slice at a time. Calliope remained behind, silent, processing. I handed her a cup of tea Fritz had prepared, one of his calming blends, no powder, no symbolism. "You did well to come," Wolfe said to her without looking up. "Any longer, and you'd have been dismissed as unstable." She nodded slowly. "I wasn't sure I wasn't." "A common result," Wolfe murmured, "when malice masquerades as routine." She left soon after, with a handshake and a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. When the front door closed, Wolfe spoke again, this time to me. "Two motives," he said. Bramble wanted revenge, Marla wanted elimination. "Elimination of Grimm?" He nodded. She feared he'd supplant her. His volatility made him expendable and conveniently suspicious. The email, the erratic behavior, she constructed a narrative. And Lem refused to comply, declined to be complicit. His principles were inconvenient. So he became a casualty? "No, Archie," Wolfe said. "He became the control subject, the one who resisted, and so he had to be removed." I dropped into my chair, and all of this over burnt toast. Wolfe closed his eyes. The burnt toast, he said, was only the overture. We sat for a while in silence. Then he spoke again, almost to himself. I despise manipulation before breakfast. Then may I suggest we avoid advertising clients for a while? Do, he muttered. And tell Fritz, tomorrow, rye. No sourdough, I've had quite enough acidity. It was over. But I knew Wolfe well enough to know that somewhere a new theory was already forming. By the time the last of the teacups had cooled and Bramble's cultivated indifference had soured into incredulous protest, Kramer was already calling in transport. I'll need statements, he said. Evidence. And Wolfe, don't think for a second I'm not getting a report from you on this lunatic food theory. Wolfe gave a slight nod, the kind he reserved for requests that were both tedious and inevitable. Mala Singh, silent now, stared into the fireplace like it held the future. Bramble, whose jaw had finally come unhinged in disbelief, tried once more to invoke privilege, clients, patents, and principles, though not necessarily in that order. You have no idea who I know, he said to Kramer as he was ushered out. This will make noise. You've made enough noise for 1 week, Kramer grunted, holding the door. I stood beside Wolfe, who had not moved an inch during the entire exit, not a twitch, not a flex, not a glimmer of self-satisfaction. That came later. For now, his silence was sufficient punctuation. When the door finally clicked shut, Wolfe sighed. Noise, he repeated, the refuge of men who confuse attention with influence. I turned back to the dining table. One plate still had an untouched slice of toast on it, now cold, forgotten. Think they'll be charged? I asked. In due course, Wolfe replied. Miss Singh may trade testimony for leniency. Mr. Bramble will bluster until the indictment is typed. But yes, I believe justice is now adequately plated. And you? I said. No comment to the press? My work is done, Wolfe murmured. Let them debate intention. I deal in fact. He rose, which was more of a benediction than a movement, and made for the plant rooms. Case closed, without a single step outside. Just the way he liked it. The next morning, Wolfe was already ensconced in the plant rooms by the time I came down with the mail. It was the usual spread, bills, circulars, and a letter from a cheese importer Wolfe had once blacklisted for mislabeling Gorgonzola. From the open door to the orchids came the soft murmur of Latin and the occasional click of pruning shears. I didn't interrupt. That room was his chapel, and the orchids his devotions. The brownstone was quiet again, as if the house itself had exhaled. No more anxious clients, no ambitious saboteurs with culinary alibis, just Fritz in the kitchen, humming faintly, and the smell of breakfast being done right. I left the mail on Wolfe's desk and took a seat with the paper. There was a brief mention of Lem Hawkins in the obituaries, no hint of murder, only quiet remembrance of a private chef known for complex flavors and reclusive brilliance. Fitting, in a way. The rest of the world would never know how close they'd come to weaponized breakfast. I glanced toward the plant rooms again. Wolfe would emerge eventually, refreshed, precise, appetite rebalanced. That was his ritual after a case. Some men drank, others confessed. Wolfe tended orchids and waited for Fritz to bring him breakfast, and justice, in its slow, buttered way, had been served. At exactly 11:07, Fritz entered the office with the gravitas of a man delivering communion. On the tray, 2 slices of toast, golden buttered edge to edge, not a shadow of char, alongside a soft poached egg, a small ramekin of quince jelly, and Wolfe's morning beer. Without a word, Fritz placed the tray on the desk and stood back. Wolfe, newly returned from his orchids, regarded the toast like a man receiving an apology in edible form. He picked up one slice, examined it, then took a bite. He closed his eyes for a moment, chewing slowly. I watched the entire performance with no small degree of satisfaction. "It's perfect," Wolfe said at last. Fritz bowed slightly, dignified and unreadable, but there was the faintest upward pull at the corner of his mouth. He turned and exited without fanfare. "Redemption," I said. "Precision," Wolfe corrected. Fritz never needed redemption. He was never at fault. Still a poetic ending, I mused. A flawless slice of toast after a week of forensic carbs. Wolfe gave me a look, half tolerance, half disdain. "I find," he said, "that poetry is best left to those not required to clean up after it." "Touché," I replied, and helped myself to the second slice. Peace, in our household, had been restored one breakfast at a time. I waited until Wolfe had taken another sip of beer before springing my final flourish. "You know," I said, "this whole thing has inspired me." He grunted. "I'm developing my own theory, not as psychological maybe, but with practical applications." "I shudder," Wolfe murmured. "It's about jam." He glanced up, a glint of reluctant interest, or dread, in his eyes. Subtle sabotage via spread inconsistency. One day raspberry, next day marmalade. The victim never knows what's coming, destabilizes their emotional core, begins questioning reality. Wolfe stared. "You are a jackanapes." "Of course, but imagine, the jam conspiracy, it has legs." "Only if you pair it with imbecility," he said. "Working title?" He gave a long, slow sigh and returned to his toast. I counted it as a win, because Wolfe didn't argue, didn't correct, didn't retreat. He just ate his breakfast. And in our corner of Manhattan, that was the closest thing to approval a man like me was likely to get.